Yeah, and thank you very, very much. Thanks a lot to Claudio, to our Basel, Hong Kong. It is indeed a great, great pleasure that we can celebrate here the King of Kowloon, the amazing work and life of Tsang Tsou Choi. I would like to also remember here especially Jonathan Napak, the great critic, a very particular friend, journalist, adventurer, traveler. Jonathan Napak was a great pioneer to put Hong Kong on the map, and I think it's extremely important that at that very moment, when the Hong Kong miracle happens with so much energy, that we remember someone who has been so instrumental in, making art in this city happen. And I will never forget when Hu Han Ru and I came to Hong Kong for the first time in 96, 97 for our research for Cities on the Move. We met Jonathan Napak at the Foreign Correspondents Club, where Jonathan always gave his appointments. And it's at that time that Jonathan told us for the first time about the King of Kowloon and about the necessity really of celebrating and mapping all these kind of modernities in the non-Western world, all these inventors and pioneers and great protagonists. And so this is to Jonathan and to to his sort of permanent celebration of these different non-Western pioneers. And I think in some kind of way Eric Hobsbawm talks about a protest against forgetting, the necessity of memory, and that's something which is important in our digital age, because I think we live in a moment where we have more and more information. It's a information society, and the exponential growth of information does not necessarily mean that there is also more memory. As Rem Koolhaas pointed out some years ago, maybe amnesia is actually at the very core of this information society, and hence the necessity to protest against forgetting and to remember practices such as the one of the King of Kowloon. The King of Kowloon came to our attention really when Hu Han Ru and I researched Cities on the Move, our exhibition on the urban fabric, on the mutation of Asian cities in the 90s, when we wanted for the first time to show all these practitioners of art and urbanism and architecture from Asia in Europe. And obviously, when we realized, making our research about urbanism and urban mutation in the 90s, what we realized was that there were these amazing pioneers from the 60s and 70s and 80s, whom no one had ever heard about in the West. And we, for example, in Japan came across metabolism, another topic, dear to me, which we then later developed into a book with Rem Koolhaas. These great pioneers like Kisho Kurokawa and Fumiko Maki, they're exactly the same generation as the King of Kowloon, born in the early and mid-20s, Fumiko Maki, of course, and also, the great practice of Kikutake, who developed such a big influence on Japanese architecture. So the metabolists. And when we then, researched in Hong Kong, it was not only Jonathan Napak, it was many other artists who told us that we have to look at the legendary artist Tsang Tsou Choi, the King of Kowloon. He's born in 1921 in Liangtang village and in Guangdong province, and fled across the border to Hong Kong in the 1930s. And he stayed in Hong Kong for the rest of his very long life. And it's important to say that actually, obviously, the King of Kowloon is his pseudonym, and the Belgian situationist Raoul van Egem says, it's something important also for our time, for the 21st century, that we think again about these possibilities actually, of using pseudonyms on art. It's something which is a bit less used now in the art world than it used to be, but it's a very important thing. When we then, came a second time to Hong Kong in 1997, Han Ru and I saw a big exhibition of the King of Kowloon at the Hong Kong Art Center. That was, I think, his first survey show. It was the first time a possibility here at the Hong Kong Art Center to really see the work together. And for us, and if you see these graffitis, it kind of reminded us, of course, of the Des Affichistes in France. It reminded us of these urban practices of Raymond Haas and Villeglé. It reminded us also of this idea of the situationists, to use strategies of détournement, to use subversive strategies of actually, infiltrating the city. And we were immediately very fascinated, actually, by this idea how the King of Kowloon derived a lot of these, very sort of activist urban interventions from traditional calligraphy. And obviously, calligraphy has historically been regarded as a very pure and also most notable form of painting. And the way how the King of Kowloon used it was a very, unusual way of using calligraphy. He used it on pavements, he used it on lampposts, as you can see here on, in all kinds of urban situations. He used it on cars and subways, on these kind of electric, boxes, and addressed all kinds of targets. One can say it was not only in some kind of way an urban infiltration, it was also a permanent protest. He targeted very concretely sometimes very obscure and trivial issues, and sometimes great and big issues. It would go from Queen Elizabeth II to the Hong Kong government, to the former chief executive of Hong Kong, Donald Tsang. These were all targets for the King of Kowloon, and he basically was always expressing in his work this conviction that Hong Kong belonged to his own ancestor. So he obviously insisted that Hong Kong belonged, that actually Kowloon belonged to him, that it was his. So it was a kind of a reclaim thing. It's also really interesting if we connect the King of Kowloon to the reclaim the city kind of movement. We can connect it to Occupy Wall Street, but we can connect it to, reclaim city movement in sort of more recent histories. He sort of insisted also on this idea that the government should actually pay him tax for the privilege of administering his birthright. So it shouldn't be him who pays tax. It should be the government paying him tax for this right of administering his birthright. And this sort of idea that obviously very often it seems nonsensical. These messages are apparently nonsensical, but there is also a deeper invocation of the past, of memory, of all kinds of things which development steadily sweeps away. So it's also very much part of what Italo Calvino calls the invisible city. The King of Kowloon insisted that traces of the city would be, remembered. And it's interesting if we kind of connect what the King of Kowloon writes to what Akbar Abbas has explained, the great writer Akbar Abbas, whose son is now such a successful contemporary artist. Akbar Abbas always said that actually, while the ancient historic, it is also a culture of transience and disappearance. So, Hong Kong is a very traditional city, but it's a city of transient disappearance. To quote Abbas, the sense of the temporary is very strong. The city is not so much a place as a space of transit where everything is provisional, ad hoc. Everything floats, currencies, values, human relations, everything floats. And that's very much the case, of the work of the King of Kowloon. He had chosen his medium to actually perfectly fit a culture of transience. His work is also a critique on the fly of a society on the move. It's as willfully impermanent as it's also an object. And that's amazing if we think that he has actually done more than 55,000 outdoors work. 55,000 outdoors work. I mean, the number, this is, almost as productive as Picasso, if we count the number of works, he has done. It's just that most of these works, no longer exist. They have been overpainted, they have been destroyed. So very much, there have been lots of official reassurances of preservation, but still, many of the works have been destroyed, and it's only a very, very small part of his works which are obviously, somewhat preserved. And so I think that's also a reason why Jehan's book, his initiative to bring this book together is so important, because many of these works today only exist in, photographic memory. And as the art historian Rudolf Arnheim once said, it's not about nostalgia if you think about memory, but we can use these fragments to invent the future. And very much so, I think, hopefully the book on the King of Kowloon will be such a toolbox, a very, very toolbox of great actuality, which will help us to, construct the future of the city, a toolbox to invent all kinds of future scenarios. And these are the few things I wanted to say, so thank you all very much, and I would now like to hand over to my two friends who are here. Maybe Ning will start.
Yeah. Okay, the essays I contribute to the book, the title is Hong Kong History of Madness. So I would like to discuss, to try to develop a new wave of the reading of Tsang Tsou Choi. Because as a cultural icon in Hong Kong, actually, there's a lot of people can get the meaning from his work. A lot of people think he's a mad guy, and another people think he's a great artist, graffiti artist. But actually, I don't think he is an artist. And also, there's a lot of organized museum trying to preserve his choreography and trying to put his work in the museum and also organize exhibition in gallery and sell his work in auction. It's not a good way to understand his work. I mean, for Hong Kong. So I think I realized this writer Chen Wan. He wrote articles about Tsang Tsou Choi. I think he's understood Tsang Tsou Choi very good. He think Tsang Tsou Choi is kind of he put some populist political meanings for Tsang Tsou Choi. Maybe can I speak Cantonese? Okay, cool. 就係咧，其實
Actually, for Tsang Tsou Choi, we have different interpretation.
但實際上，我覺得咧，
In fact, according
自己嘅生命
to his own logic
嗰啲行為
and behavior,
有啲諗法咧係
I think some thoughts,
變成認為係一個好偉大嘅藝術家。
some people may think that he's a very great artist and preserve his works in museums or art galleries and so as to increase its value. I think that's a misunderstanding of Mr. Tsang Tsou Choi. I think and he's a little bit madman and he's a man with no value. I think
佢寫嗰啲圖咧，
if you put,
分析係
I think there's meaningless to analyze the calligraphy work of Tsang Tsou Choi.
好靚屋企掛。
If you hand his work in your dining room or living room, I think that's maybe more appropriate. Because in Hong Kong, from the history point of view of Kowloon, and he had some imagination of Hong Kong and add his own opinions. And then he started his calligraphy on the street. Actually, he wanted to get his land back from the government. That's why he had this action. I think it is a very aggressive movement. So it's a kind of expression of his political position. So that's my understanding towards Mr. Tsang Tsou Choi. And I think, of course, it's one part of Hong Kong's culture, but it's more in line with his own logic. More interestingly, Mr. Tsang Tsou Choi is a mobile artist. He marks the street with his calligraphies in various places. He claimed he's the rightful ruler of Kowloon in his calligraphy. To some extent, he reminds me of Kowloon town because this area is a slum. And it's in Hong Kong. It was ruled by Qing dynasty and then ruled by UK, and then now we was ruled under the PRC. And I think Hong Kong's identity is a bit vague. I can understand many people's thoughts of Tsang Tsou Choi because, in fact, he represents Hong Kong's confusion, a lack of ruler, or so if you want to understand Tsang Tsou Choi, I think it represents the voice of Hong Kong's people, or Hong Kong's ordinary people live with relatively poor conditions. So it also reflects the characteristics of some groups of Hong Kong people. Now we have many books related to Tsang Tsou Choi. Compared with China, in Sichuan province, we have another figure named Tsang Tsou Choi, and so he said that he could rule Wulan, Hunan, Sichuan province, and he's very similar with Tsang Tsou Choi. He make up a song or make up a story saying that there is a fish in the river and singing that he is the emperor of the country. And then he also occupied actually he aroused a lot of discussion. Then he was put into the jail in China. There's another artist from Hong Kong, and he had an interview with this Zheng Zhoulong in China. So compare two of them, I think they have different consequences. For Mr. Tsang Tsou Choi, he has a lot of exhibitions of his artwork, but for his counterpart in mainland China, and he was put into the jail. So when we think of these events, they are madmen. Who would believe that there is a fish in the river and singing that somebody is the king of the country? That's insane. So I think this is a way to stir some discussion from the public. So I think maybe they represent the warriors from the grass class, but they still, I still think their methods are too aggressive. I think this is the way that they fight with the government or fight with the society, and I think their madness are generated by their, not only by themselves, but only generated from the societies. So I'm a little bit embarrassed when I'm sitting here, because when they asked me to give this discussion here today, I actually told them that there are many experts in this area that they can invite to attend this discussion. So my role here is more tend to represent Hong Kongers. So we grew up here, and we have witnessed the artwork of the King of Kowloon. So when we look back the whole event, we have seen. So I remember in this year's art fair, I saw some artwork from the King of Kowloon. I was shocked. Every time when every time when I see some artwork from Tsang Tsou Choi in art fairs, I was surprised. So I think this event is very interesting, because his story was translated from Cantonese to English, and then from English back to Cantonese. So there's some misunderstanding and misinterpretation that confuse me. So when we talk about artist movements and art, and so what I have gained from what I have gained actually is different from what I saw. And what I understand about Mr. Tsang Tsou Choi. And after some time, I think in Hong Kong, there are many reports about Tsang Tsou Choi by the Hong Kong media. Why someone can just write his artwork or make some marks on the street? I think that we can explore this event in depth because maybe that's associated with Hong Kong's concept of space. So take a Hong Kong CECS example. If you want to have Hong Kong Fair, then it's very convenient for you to travel to here to attend Hong Kong Fair. Hong Kong, no matter the government or the individuals or other parties, everybody are well organized and managed. So in terms of space, it is well managed. And the merge of Tsang Tsou Choi actually breaks some rules of Hong Kong's society. So, and also he liberate his own imagination and illustrated by his artwork. So in his imagination, and he could not control his imagination. So now the King of Kowloon is maybe well known by the others or even the whole world, but his artwork on the street are cleaned continuously. So now for us it's quite difficult to find his work on the street. Maybe we can find 20 his artworks on the streets. That's maybe because the way we managed outer space. So the conflict between the King of Kowloon and Hong Kong government, I can see this is not the only case. We can see many other cases as well. So we have some activists to also do some campaigns against the government. I remember Mr. Lau Hiubo, he won the Nobel Prize, and then no media was allowed to report his story. So then he wanted to promote this event to a higher level so that everybody could discuss it. So they started a campaign. So everybody wear the same shirt and they just had some slogan and show their support to Mr. Li Xiaobo. So one group of people, they go out one by one, like a train, and travel from here to Luohu. And then when they travel from Hong Kong to mainland China, they reach a line. That line actually is the border line between the Hong Kong and Luohu border. So, and then he was detained by the police. Then later on, it was broadcasted by the media. So now. So at that time, more people joined the discussion. So I think this ideology is quite similar to the message that the King of Kowloon wanted to deliver to the public. We want to express ourselves, so we try to find our own way to set out our voice. Now, as an artist, I think the most valuable thing is to liberate yourself and to get out of the boxes.
Wonderful. Thank you both very, very much. There's so much, I think, here for discussion. Maybe one or two questions to both of you, and then we can open it up for questions from the floor, things you want to ask the speakers. I mean, one of the things which I thought was very interesting is this, critique of it becoming a fetish, right? And the idea that, the practice is obviously, not within sort of isolated objects which becoming fetishized, but the practice was a practice of street art in some kind of way. And that obviously raises the issue of archive and the issue also of how such a practice can actually be documented, how such a practice can actually survive. Now, the book which Jeanne is doing is obviously one possibility, in terms of memory, because a book is a great way, a book or a website to kind of gather all these forgotten traces. But I think it raises all kinds of other issues, how ephemeral art can actually, be archived. It raises a lot of issues about archive. And I was just wondering, because of your critique, saying that it feels alienating to you to see such objects, in the context then of an exhibition or in the context of an art fair, how you feel one could find other ways of actually, having a sustained presence of such a practice and avoid that it disappears. And obviously I think it's also interesting, is it art or is it not art? That's a whole other question. I mean, I think one can also see it in the context of street poetry, because it's obviously someone who had messages to say, message to the world, and I think in some kind of way it's clearly an in-between practice. It's on the one hand public writing, it's street poetry, it's also visual art, but maybe that's not such a problem. We think about the panel yesterday with all the artists of the 89 plus generation, which we did with Simon Castetz. It's maybe no longer such an issue, in which box we do it. It's just a really fascinating practice which certainly deserves to be remembered, which deserves to be preserved. And so my question to you, if not as a fetish, then how else, and what can else be done than a book?
When we talk about archive and how to preserve our art inheritage, I think we need to make it. We should preserve it at a point, not after many years, then we have suddenly come out an idea that, we need to preserve it. Take Tsang Tsou Choi as an example. If we would consider it as cultural inheritance, actually is very controversial whether or not we should preserve his work. People have different ideas. So it's very controversial. But when we try to preserve his calligraphy, and many people, if the majority of the people agree to preserve his work, then we have to do that. But from my point of view, I don't think his work is appropriate to be put in galleries. It should be remain on the street. I think archive is one thing. Interpretation is another thing. For instance, for Kowloon town, it is a very interesting slum, and with a very high population in density. So in Hong Kong, the way to display Kowloon town are varies. So after some development, it's very hard for us to imagine what it was like in the old days. Actually, the density was really, really high. So, moreover, so when we are dealing with historical elements, we need to do more studies and take Tsang Tsou Choi as example. If you found his calligraphy is very interesting, I think, and when you try to tell the story of Tsang Tsou Choi, I think you are not on the right track. You have ignored the social value of his work. So, when we are dealing with historical elements, and illustration method is very important. I think for Tsang Tsou Choi, his work is better to remain on the street. So I to give you some example in early days. In Kuntong, my wife lived in Kuntong before. So recently, now the human Fong is going through the renovation or transformation. So a lot of old buildings are to be demolished. And my wife lived in Choi Ping village. So along the Winning village and Choi Hong and to Mong Ko, in old days, you could see many calligraphies of Tsang Tsou Choi. And other days, and there was I passed by. Actually, I found out there was an old theater to be demolished, and there were some calligraphies of Tsang Tsou Choi nearby. And then I put. And I read some comments on my Facebook. It's so pity that the calligraphy of Tsang Tsou Choi is going to be cleaned. And all these calligraphies will be gone. So and then some people write to me, so what should we do to protect his artwork or protect all these calligraphies? And my friend emailed me saying that actually there are some art galleries have kept some words of Tsang Tsou Choi, and a week later, and there was scaffolding there and block the whole entrance. And then for us, I think this art piece is gone. Maybe it will reappear in the art gallery. So I think the disappear of the artwork of Tsang Tsou Choi is one thing. Of course, his artwork is associated with his life, but his role and his artwork make people think a lot about him, such as his life and his mindset, etc. And his identity. So how the government responds to his identity is another issue. So I think if his calligraphy show up on the street is one thing, and if his artwork on the street disappear, then it's another thing. So, how could we preserve his artwork? I will use my own method. I would maybe make a tour and show the others to his work, but maybe not the actual work, but some photos of his artworks, and so as to let people have a knowledge about his calligraphy, and let them know that some artworks on the street disappear due to some renovation or some other methods.
Great idea. This tour should happen. I think it would be very successful and many people would join it. So maybe an idea when the book gets launched, to not have a fixed book launch, but to have a book launch on the move, visiting these different sites. That is a great idea. One other thing I was thinking, yesterday when Simon Castetz and I moderated this panel about the 89 plus generation, which is a project we founded to map the new generation of artists, born in the digital age, artists born in 89 and younger. Ning talked about Joshua Wong, and I kind of thought it's maybe interesting to talk a little bit about new activism in Hong Kong, because if you think about, the King of Kowloon, it's a way how he actually not only wanted to break the rules of Hong Kong society, as you said, but also express himself, right? It's a way of self-expression, which maybe today would happen digitally, or would maybe also happen digitally. However, it could also be a combination. And yesterday, when you talked about Joshua Wong, you talked about the way Joshua Wong, as a high school student, uses today basically social media to mobilize hundreds of thousands of students in Hong Kong to protest against this influence on the curriculum and and so on. So I was kind of wondering, in the spirit of the King of Kowloon, if you could talk a little bit about activism now, how it connects, and also obviously, what it means in the digital age. It's kind of fascinating to think, what would this form of graffiti to be in the digital age, and what would it mean in the digital age?
Interestingly, in recent years, we have many protests on the streets, and every time we have updates, or we have a young generation to join us. I think just like the politician of Tsang Tsou Choi, especially when I saw Wang Zifeng and mobile tens of thousands of people to protest or start some campaigns. It really changed my view on the young generation. They're born after 1990s. If you really look into the society, I think you will have some findings, and I think the teenagers, they are very active on the street, and they are making the history. That's magnificent. In Asia, I think the young people in mainland China and young people in Hong Kong are incomparable. Maybe that's because the constraint of the environment, because in mainland China there is no political environment for them. When I write the articles related to Tsang Tsou Choi, I think the young generation born after the 1980s, they have some they share the same qualities. That it's, I think they have dismantled all the rigid rules, and you can do what you want, and you can say what you want to say. So that's a really very high level of expressing yourself. I think madness is the peak of self-expression. You can break all the rules. So that's really incredible. I think Hong Kong, in terms of space or even our living conditions, I think we have a lot of pressures. So we need to move fast and in our lives. Why we are doing that? That's because the design of the whole city and the housing price is so high. We need to work very hard so that we can make a living, and we need to spend many years to repay our mortgage. So Hong Kong people are very easily to go to extreme. That is only focus on money. Money is everything. So you are not there to risk, because you don't have the guts to risk. But over the past few years, maybe the last generation had laid a solid foundation for us. We have more, maybe we have some luxury to risk. I think this is a kind of liberation which enable us to expand our imagination. And I think the people who are born after 1980s or 1990s, they have inherited something from their parents, because their parents had laid a solid foundation for them. And I think in the public areas are occupied by many things. So the room for creativity is not very. You need to find a new way out to break the boundary and the rules. Otherwise, nobody would pay attention to you. So there is the Hong Kong's media can control all the informations in Hong Kong. And there was an example in past few years, Hong Kong's news. There was a TVB, that's Hong Kong television station, and it's getting similar to mainland China's TV channels. That's why they give a new name. That's a CTV. Some people starting to fight against it because they don't like the Hong Kong's TV channel become similar to that of mainland's TV program. So now they have some. There was an example that is there was we have every time when you have something that you want to broadcast, you need to be there at the first at the earliest time, and then just express yourself. That I think that's very important message we can get. That we need to use the least resource to express the most meaningful meanings.
Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes, so we can maybe take one question. If there is an urgent question from the floor. There's a question here, yeah. Maybe have the microphone for the gentleman. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, Hans. Ravi. Hi. I was just wondering, you were talking about the 89 and now. The difference between putting yourself out physically on the street and doing physical work is different from being on Facebook or on social media and protesting. At one point, the physicality of yourself, of your body out there, is a big difference. And there's no safety in that physicality. And you see a lot of, at what point does that become physical? Like in the Arab Spring, or what point? So there is a difference between what we, and the second question is about, the question to me is not whether we should document. There's so many things which are happening which we don't know about or we have forgotten. But how we create the context of the documentation. What kind of book do we create? What kind of archive do we create? Not whether we create the archive, but the information age also provides the possibility of creating a very complex context of the archives. Thank you.
Well, it's interesting, the first question, I mean, what Ning, you said yesterday about Joshua Wong, I mean, many of these practices involve both. I mean, it kind of uses, it seems to me that it uses social media, but then leads to a very physical occupation of space, right? A very physical presence. It's both.
And actually, internet space and are separated. We should not think that the internet space is internet space, physical space is physical space. But under most of us circumstance, you will do some work firstly on some internet space, and then you will receive some response from the others. Then when this response are strong enough, then we can go out to the street and have some physical campaign. So look at our living environments. I think the internet space are merged with the physical space. Why we are sitting here to discuss this? Because we can discuss face to face. On the internet, we can also have some discuss through the internet, but it's not a face to face internet. It's not a face to face communication. I hope I can answer your question right. I hope now no matter you want to document your words or not, you are recorded. So we need to, when your things are documented, you have the right to interpret the whole thing from your point of view. I think that the King of Kowloon is a good example. He has been over-interpreted. Of course, as artists, when we do some artwork, we have never think of how to be documented. But up to this point, I don't know what to discuss.
It's also, maybe just to add to that question of the context of the archive, I thought the idea of the walk is a very interesting one, and we can obviously imagine a physical walk, almost like the Swiss urbanist Lucius Burckhardt imagined it, where we could imagine these works again to pop up in our imagination by going on a sort of a tour. But we could also imagine a digital walk. There is a great potential, I think, not only of a book, but there's a great potential there to actually recontextualize these works in augmented reality, that you can suddenly walk through the city and they pop up again on your digital devices at the very place where you actually physically are. So I think there's a lot of potential there to contextualize the work digitally and physically, in sort of in the future. Maybe one very last question. I know we've got many more questions in the room. I suggest, because Claudio says we need to leave the room, that we now close the conversation here. This is a salon. We all move outside and you can ask your questions individually to the speakers. I just had a 1 minute last question to actually both of our speakers, because I promised them that we would raise that. And that is really, what's next? Because there are certainly other pioneers in Hong Kong or mainland China whom we should remember, and as part of that campaign of a protest against forgetting, the book on the King of Kowloon is now out there. What are other pioneers you think should be remembered? What should be the next book?
Maybe we can make a book for George Wong.
Great, and you?
I think in Hong Kong, we have many old-timers or old artists to support us, such as Mr. Chen Yusen, Ju Henghua. They have done a lot of work for us before our work.
Wonderful. Thank you all very, very much. And let's move outside and continue. Thank you.